Hi, and welcome to the GDPR Basics webinar, How GDPR Impacts Recruiting in the US and the EU. My name is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and I'm the founder of Workology and your webinar moderator today. Before we begin, I wanted to share a few housekeeping rules, and just to let you know that the slides will be made available after the presentation, as well as recording of the presentation for you to view again and share with your colleagues and peers. This is an interactive webinar presentation, and we encourage you to ask questions and take part in our poll questions. I'm certain that this presentation will generate a lot of meaningful discussion, and if you are viewing the presentation live, you can ask questions in the chat box, and I'll be doing my best to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Don't fret if we don't get to your question. We will be getting back to all attendees to answer questions throughout the next week and few days. Before I introduce my panelists, I do want to make you aware that if you're in the US, this presentation is approved for 1 global HRCI and SHRM recertification credits. Comeet will be sending you your certification credit codes on Monday after the presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the recorded video. For those of you that are waiting or watching the recorded webinar, please check your email inbox at the end of this presentation. Those will be made available to you, and you'll be able to get the information that you need to be able to submit your credits. For those of you who are not in the US, this is the equivalent of the CIPD bodies. So it isn't applicable to you. We'll move on. Before I get started, I did just want to mention that this presentation and this webinar is powered in part by Comeet. Comeet is a collaborative recruiting technology platform designed to help you hire quickly, finding and screening the best talent for your organization. Comeet helps you work more efficiently with your hiring managers and interviewers to reduce hiring bottlenecks. Comeet offers a number of great resources, including more webinars like this one, as well as an email newsletter and other helpful resources with the goal of engaging and providing education for the HR and recruiting practitioner. All right, it's time to meet our panelists. Once again, my name's Jessica Miller-Merrill, and I've worked in global HR and recruiting in a variety of capacities for nearly 20 years. As the founder of Workology and the Workology podcast, I've really been committed to providing resources for the HR and recruiting leader. And I'm really excited about this particular presentation because I feel like it provides a really amazing global practitioner perspective, maybe one that we haven't seen in other GDPR presentations. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. The first panelist is Debbie Clement. She has over 20 years of experience in developing recruiting technologies for SMEs and training recruiters. Debbie is a Comeet evangelist and heads Peoplely, a software and services company whose mission is to transform and rehumanize recruiting for ambitious businesses. Welcome, Debbie.
Morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Nice to be here and nice to see you all there.
Awesome. The next individual that I'm introducing is Tiffany Kemp. She is a commercial and contracting and negotiation specialist and the founder of Devant, a commercial consulting firm that provides contract drafting, review, and negotiation support to medium and small sized businesses. The Devant team is currently helping many of its clients get ready for GDPR. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Nice to be here.
Our last and final, but not final, is Matt Dis, and he's the CTO with over 25 years experience in PLEs and SMEs, specializing in tech, recruitment, mobile, and e-commerce. He advises a number of companies on business growth and IT strategy. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Jessica. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here.
All right, let's kind of go through the agenda quickly. I know we started a little bit late. So we are going to be kind of going through some GDPR recruiting basics. Then we'll talk about the EU versus the United States. And we will take a number of expert panel questions. This is the part that I'm really, really excited about because this is unfiltered, engaging, spirited discussion and conversation with these experts on the subject of GDPR. And lastly, we'll take your questions. So without further ado. Tiffany, I'm going to let you take it from here.
First of all, we unmute our microphone before we start speaking. Lesson number one. Well, it's lovely to be with you all. So we are going to be having a bit of a debate. So if you've joined this webinar anticipating a lecture that you can take notes from and follow to the letter in order to ensure GDPR compliance, I'm afraid you're in for a bit of a disappointment. What you're going to get is some discussion around some of the key issues around GDPR. Don't take this as legal advice, folks. Consult your attorney before making decisions that might affect your business. But we will give you some absolute from the ground inputs into our experiences and our views on what the GDPR landscape is going to mean for recruiting over the next 12, 24 months and ongoing. We're going to be looking at some of the opportunities that it creates for you. The things we've been focusing on mostly, I think most practitioners have been focusing on, are the risks. And there certainly are some hefty old risks we'll be taking a look at. But we want to give you some contextual understanding of what you might be thinking about doing in your organization to prepare for GDPR, how it might impact you, what you can do to maximize the benefits you get from the opportunities and minimize the impact of those potential risks. And please do engage with us. We might not get to all the questions during the webinar, but we'll try and get to you afterwards if we don't. So in terms of what GDPR is all about, if you happen to have been living in a cave for the last year or two, you might not know that it is the Global Data Protection Regulation. It's a piece of European legislation, and on the 25th of May this year, it will immediately become law across all EU member states. So that's a key thing to bear in mind with a regulation. There's no further action required by the member states. All that's needed is for the EU to put this regulation in place, and it instantly becomes law everywhere around Europe, whether we like it or not. It provides protection for individual data subjects, so that's human beings. The old Data Protection Act, which this is replacing, related specifically to living individuals. Now, GDPR doesn't actually state they need to be alive, so potentially you might be thinking about data protection rights for people who have passed on, as well as the ones currently inhabiting the world. So that'll add an interesting new dimension. The key driver is that each individual has some control over their personal information. So they should be in the driving seat. And if you've been watching the news, you've been seeing all the fun and games with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. One of the big points that came out of that was that these individuals on Facebook didn't know their data was going to be used by Cambridge Analytica for the purposes that it was used for. And that's obviously a key breach of the individual data subject's rights. And GDPR is aimed at strengthening each individual's rights to govern how their data is processed and stored and who has access to it. So from our perspective in the recruitment arena, the data subjects are job candidates, may also be you and your clients actually, but it covers the whole application, screening and hiring processes. And in case you think you don't really need to worry about it too much, what we are seeing already in the run-up to the 25th of May is in the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office starting to flex their muscles with fines. Under GDPR, their powers are growing, and they will be able to enforce fines of the greater of 20 million euros or 4% of your global turnover. So this really, really matters. We need to get it right. We can expect to see some scalps on sticks in the next 6 to 12 months as the various enforcement agencies around Europe start to flex their muscles. So over to you, Jessica.
All right, so we're going to start with our first poll question. So give me a moment here while we set up, but this is the question that we're going to be asking. Have you been asked by your candidates about GDPR compliance over the last 90 days? So let me exit out of this. And Tiffany, have you seen this happening already in your work?
Yes, we have certainly seen from our clients, people getting in touch to say, what information do you hold about us? So it's not something that we've experienced at Devant as a business, but certainly our clients are starting to get a lot of questions and some subject access requests starting to come through, which are causing pain already.
And so if somebody is getting a request, are they required to comply with that request? I mean, it's not GDPR yet, so there's not fines involved, right?
So under the Data Protection Act, which is currently in place and has been around for the last 20 years, there are still fines, and data subjects do have the right to make a subject access request. The big difference is that whereas under the Data Protection Act, an organisation is entitled to charge a small admin fee, so £10 or £20 for fulfilling a subject access request, under GDPR, you can't charge any money. So I was having a conversation this morning with one of our clients who said it costs them around about £5,000 to respond to a subject access request, because they have data all over the place on lots of different systems. So it's quite a labour intensive exercise. Their systems weren't designed with GDPR or data protection in mind, as I think is probably true of pretty much all of us. And they're really worried that actually having lots of these subject access requests could really kill any decent sized organization.
So the results from the poll showed that there are not a lot of requests happening yet. I'll send out the official results here at the end of the presentation, but over 80% of respondents have not gotten a request in the last 90 days. So I definitely think that as we get closer to the May 25th date, we'll be seeing more requests. So we'll see that yes number increase.
Jessica, let me jump in there. It's Debbie. I just want to say that we've had one this week, and before that, I don't think we've had a data request. I can remember one back in 2008, but we've definitely had one this week from a candidate who had been rejected from a role for the second time within the organisation. He'd applied for 2 different roles, and he obviously took umbrage to it and asked for a complete deletion. So we had our processes tested this week, which was good.
Wow. Well, let's move forward to candidate rights and talk a little bit about that, if you will, Tiffany and Debbie.
Debbie, do you want to kick off here?
No, you go first.
Okay. Sorry, you've had quite a bit from me, that's all. So in terms of the rights that individuals have, what I would recommend for all of you, and I know that this is one of the resources that Comeet's going to be sharing at the end of the webinar, is that you go to the Information Commissioner's website, so ico.org.uk, not just ico.org, that's the International Coffee Organisation. They have lots of really useful information to help you get your head around precisely what rights each individual has. So basically, they are entitled to determine what their personal data is collected for, where it's stored, who it's shared with, and when it might be deleted. So the website ico.org.uk, and if you go to the website, it's got a list of all the specific rights. But if you remember, everybody that submits an application has the right to know how their data is going to be used, who it's going to be shared with. Is it going to remain within the EU, or is it potentially travelling out of the EU? Are there any automated processes that are going to be applied to it? So, for example, if you were to have some sort of pre-screening process built into your platform that potentially assess somebody on the basis of their exam results, their university qualifications, or their geographical location, then an individual is entitled to understand the automated decision making that might affect them and their consideration for that role.
I'll jump in now. Thanks, Tiffany. I've got a big whiteboard in my office, and just looking at it, or just looking at I guess what I would say there is try and see things from their perspective and put yourself in their shoes as you work through your processes in your business. So, for example, we've got outreach when we're perhaps headhunting candidates to consider what are the activities you're doing there. You've got an active applicant on a job board. The activity and the purpose of collecting data may be different between those two. You've got talent pool nurturing. The purpose is different from kind of an active job board applicant as well. So kind of take that into account, I would say. The ICO website is brilliant. And Tiff, I've got a question there for you. That's our UK website. But if you're operating maybe in France, or if you're operating maybe somewhere else in the world, which website do people go to? Can they still go to that ICO website? Is that still relevant?
So because the GDPR is a regulation, it applies in exactly the same way across all member states of the EU. But there are still some opportunities for little localizations to happen. The guidance notes, for example, are being produced by each member state individually. So you might find that you're getting subtly different guidance if you go to the French Information Commission's website, or the German one, or any of the other national offices. The advantage of the ICO one for everybody on this webinar is that it's in English, and therefore you should hopefully all be able to read it. If you want to look at the legislation itself, if you go to the Europa website, you can download the legislation in the languages of all of the member states. It's translated to everybody's language, and that is the law. The tricky thing that we're all going to be dealing with over the next few years is that the precise way the law is going to be interpreted and enforced will be determined over the course of the next few years. And at the moment, there are still quite a few bits of it that are not really nailed down in enough clarity for us to know precisely what we should be doing and what sort of activity is going to be good enough as far as the regulators are concerned. But generally, sorry, long answer to a short question, ICO should be a good place to start, and you won't go too far wrong, but there may be some slight differences as you wander around the EU and go to the different country sites. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Tiffany. It's a bit like religion. It's open to interpretation.
Absolutely.
Real quick, we got a question that says, where do I ask questions? And so just go to the chat box there and go ahead and enter in your question, and then I'll be going through those throughout the course of this presentation. Any resources also that Tiffany, Debbie, Matt, myself, or whoever shares, they are in this presentation. So at the end of the presentation, we have a slide that has all those links that we mentioned throughout the presentation available to you. So don't despair if you missed a nugget of wisdom that one of our panelists shares. The purpose of this slide is just to really just reiterate, and in the conversation as we're prepping for this webinar, we talked about that the GDPR impacts recruitment and selection. So once that candidate goes from candidate to employee, the regulations differ, but GDPR is really that recruitment and selection piece of the puzzle that we're going to be really diving into today.
I'd echo that. It's and I think I'd just underline the purpose in each of those stages. I don't know if anybody maps out their complete recruitment cycle and what they do at each activity, but the purpose behind each of those activities can sometimes change. So it's just something to be really, really aware of.
We'll move on. Debbie, can you walk us through some impacts, US, and then also the European Union for us in the next couple slides?
So these are just some of the things that I'm kind of aware of that are happening. And Tiff, do feel free to back me on this, because you've got far deeper knowledge than I have. I still sometimes think that GDPR, oh my goodness, you know, we call it GDPR in our office, because that's how we feel about it. But some of the things that you just might be caught unawares of. So for example, if you have a US office that is advertising jobs on a global basis, you may well get UK applicants popping into your ATS system over there. How are you going to deal with those? So that's just kind of something to be aware of. You might be offshoring some of your activities. So if you're doing some background checks, that you might have that being dealt with over in Asia, but it's actually dealing with EU candidates that you're background checking there as well. So that's something to be kind of aware of as well. And something that was new that came out of our discussions and dry runs this week was, Tiffany, jump in here by all means, US companies will need a data protection officer in the EU. But I have a question on that. Does that stand for Asian companies as well, if they're dealing with companies in the EU too, Tiffany?
So it depends on how big they are. So you only actually need a data protection officer if you're processing large quantities of data or you're processing sensitive personal data. So that would include, for example, information about race, gender, sexuality, religion, criminal record, those sorts of things. So some of those things will definitely come into hiring databases. Or if you're a government organization. So yeah, if you're a large organization. Thank you, Maureen. Even if you are based outside of the EU, if you're processing the data of EU citizens, you should have somebody keeping an eye on GDPR. And even if you don't fall into the category that say you have to appoint a data protection officer, it's a good idea to have a nominated individual within the organization who's responsible for making sure that you're complying with GDPR. So shall I carry on this one, Jessica? Are you happy for?
Yeah, we should move forward.
Yeah. So bear in mind that it doesn't just affect what you do. So the first step that we go through with our clients in their GDPR readiness is get big whiteboard and lots of colored pens and draw a little map of what data, what personal data comes into your organization and where it goes, who processes it. So it might be, oh, there's somebody rustling. I don't know if you can mute yourself, whoever's rustling there. It might include, for example, the candidates processing platform that you're using. It might include job board providers. It might include third-party marketers. It might include interviewing teams that you use, or perhaps consultants that come to help doing assessment centers for you and that sort of thing. So this data will travel far and wide. And first of all, you need to understand where it's going and make sure that you've looked at all of those different stages, and make sure that you know how the data comes in, how it's stored, who has access to it, and if a data subject asks to have their data removed, that you can actually get it removed. Okay, that's absolutely critical, and you can't do that if you don't know where it is.
All right, thank you guys. Let's go to our second interactive poll question. This one I think is going to be insightful, and I want to get Matt into the conversation here. I will be launching this here in a second, but what is your biggest area of concern as it relates to the GDPR? Is it preparation, regulation and monitoring, the fines, your compliance, or vendor partner compliance? So let me just load the poll. Here we go. All right, so we'll just give a minute here for you guys to share your insights. Matt, what is your biggest area of concern as it relates to the GDPR?
Well, maybe just turn that around. I would say that if anyone hasn't started any preparation, that should really be their biggest concern at the moment, because it's only a month and a bit away before it comes in. So having been through a number of these exercises with different clients, it does take a fairly long time to get these preparations in place. So if you haven't started preparing, it's better late than never, but it's be aware that you haven't got that much time to go. I think one of my biggest areas of concerns is vendor and partner compliance, really, because it's very difficult to, you can be as watertight as you want on GDPR, but you're depending on them to be the same. And if they're not, then that's going to cause both parties problems, really.
I'd echo that with you, Matt, there as well. Just looking at the poll results there from Jessica.
Yeah, interesting. Even though Matt, you gave it like a push. You were encouraging people to vote for compliance. They're interested in their compliance first. But I would say that your compliance involves the vendor partner sort of side of things, as we'll talk about a little bit more here.
Mm-hmm. I think from vendors, I'm speaking from an in-house recruiting perspective here, can their systems cope? And there's a lot of people digging out their activities today as well. So what's their processes? I'm just thinking in terms of data breaches when we're processing candidate information. It's really important to understand what kind of systems are they operating on. Sometimes we just have no idea who else they're connecting with behind the scenes from a technology perspective, which can leave us wide open.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the other changes between the Data Protection Act and GDPR is that whereas previously under the Data Protection Act, the data controller, which is the entity that's responsible for collecting the data and deciding what's happening to it, so the company that's looking to recruit in this case, has liability for what happens to that data. All of the data processors, the various vendors and other participants in the process would, under the Data Protection Act, only have a contractual liability to the data controller. Under GDPR, all of those data processors, all of those people in the supply chain effectively, all have direct liability to the data subject, and they can all be fined directly under GDPR. So that's a bit of a shift, whereas previously it was only the data controller, the recruiter, that would have been liable for the breach as far as fines are concerned. Under GDPR, every single party in the chain could be liable for their own breach and could be subject to that 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover fine.
I think that's a really good point, and is what I was saying is really your compliance is under your control, third parties isn't. And you have to rely on them to have the same level of compliance as you do.
Absolutely.
Can I just unpack that and work that one through? So say, for example, you are using a job board aggregator and sifter off-site to process applications before they come through to you. How would that play out? I'm just kind of wondering.
So we've had quite a few discussions about this in the office here, and this is going to be, it's really going to be watch this space over the next few years to see how this lot pans out. So our analysis of this is that the data controller is the organization looking to hire, because they are the ones that drive the fact that this particular role is being advertised and that somebody is being sought to fill this particular position. The job board would be a data processor. They're taking the information from the hirer, maybe directly, maybe through other third parties, and they're advertising the role. They're collecting the candidate data, the applications, the CVs, to pass back up the chain to the hirer. So the job board is a data processor. It does have liability for the way that it looks after that candidate data, for securing appropriate data consent from that candidate, as to all the things it's going to do with the data, and making sure that it has appropriate IT security in place, operational security and physical security, to keep all of that candidate data safe.
Just a quick point on that is, if you are a candidate yourself and you put your details onto a job aggregator site, who's the data controller in that case?
So are you talking about a situation where there isn't a particular role? You're basically submitting your CV to somebody's CV pool?
Yeah, so you might go on one of the job boards and they say, put your CV on here, and you enter your details and update your CV in the hope that someone might find it.
You're thinking about something like a CV library, for example.
Correct, yeah.
So in that case, CV library would be the data controller, because they're the entity that solicits the personal data from the candidates and that decides what they're going to do with it. So they're the ones who decide who are they going to give the CV to, where are they going to store it, and what's going to happen to it next.
Okay, so in that case, the actual company hiring almost becomes a data processor.
It is possible to have a co-controller once things have moved forward, but yeah, if a company is basically asking for CVs from somebody else's CV pool, then that's debatable. I would think of myself as a controller if I was in that position, actually, even though you're getting that data from somewhere else. It's just you're not getting it from the data subject, you're getting it then from another controller, from the CV aggregator.
I think one of the advantages of GDPR is that it kind of removes the need to figure out who's a controller.
That's true. You're all on the hook. Doesn't matter who you are, you've got to be on the hook somehow.
I can see we've had a question from Stephanie. Omer, do you want to step in here? And I can say that Tiffany is holding Omer's feet to the fire, Stephanie, as you know, so Comeet will have robust processes.
I don't know if Omer wants to hop on right now. I will respond to Stephanie's question about Comeet and GDPR compliance. We have a number of resources Comeet does that are providing their data storage, the deletion processes, and all that information. I will say that I believe in looking at researching a lot of the other systems and services that Comeet's is one of the easiest and well thought out processes when it comes to GDPR compliance.
I can verify that because we just hit the delete button this week and it was super easy. Thank you, Comeet.
Well, I feel like we kind of already answered the panel question a little bit through that. So I'll move on to the next question for ourselves because we are getting a lot of questions coming in. I want to make sure we have time for those. So the May 25th deadline is coming. That's why we're here, right? So what should we be doing right now? What are the things that we need to do?
May I?
Sure.
So the first thing to do is get your head around where your data is. So get your team in a room with the whiteboard and the color pens and draw some pictures. Where does your data go? And keep digging until you get to the end. If it's on a system of some description, if it goes onto this software platform, where is that hosted? Where's it backed up? Who has access to it? If it goes out to some third-party vendor, where do they put it? What do they do with it? What controls have you got? So I'd say the first step for everybody, if you haven't done it already, because you can't do any of the other stuff without this bit, is make sure you know what data you're collecting and where it all goes. So that's my number one tip.
I would just add to that. I've seen a few fairly comprehensive spreadsheets which let you effectively do this data audit, and you put down what the data is, what the legal basis for holding it is, whether it goes to any third parties. And not only is that useful for your GDPR compliance preparations, but it's also very useful if you get a subject access request. You've got all that data in one place and you can show exactly where things are without having to try and dig it up again.
And also in terms of the recruitment processes, I think there's always a danger that you might think that somebody in your organization is dealing with it, but there's nobody really with the in-depth knowledge of what recruitment processes you are actively involved in and the physicality of what you are doing on a day-to-day basis. So that's something to bear in mind. Is those spreadsheets are great. Map out your recruitment process, every single thing, and that includes everything from kind of outreach to job applicants to talent pooling to graduate nurture. Just map every single piece of that recruitment process out. Like Matt says, what's the data, what's the legal basis, who are the third parties that you're using, so you get a fully complete, clear picture about what you're doing from a recruitment perspective.
I would also say one of the most important things is to make sure that this is led from board level. I've been a few of the clients I work at. I mean, it's one of the jobs that no one wants to do. There aren't many volunteers to be a data officer. I'm not sure it's the most interesting thing that people want to do, but it does need to be led from the board. Otherwise, it will get divvied out amongst other people, and no one will really actually do it unless it's led from the top.
And one of the sad things about this is that if we'd all been doing what we were supposed to be doing under the Data Protection Act, it would be a doddle. It would be so easy because there's not actually that big a difference between GDPR and the Data Protection Act. The biggest difference is the size of the fines if you get it wrong. And so if your organization has got good data control already, there's not going to be an awful lot of extra work for you. You might need to worry about a couple of extra processes, and some of the timescales will have shifted around a bit, but you'll be in a good place. Chances are you're like 99% of us and have been kind of paying lip service to data protection for the last 20 years, and it's suddenly getting real, and you need to start taking it seriously.
One thing I'll just add before we move to the poll question is really sit down and talk to your recruiters and sourcers, because there are so many Chrome extensions and like one-off tools that these guys and gals, especially in the US, are using that I feel like it could be a potential liability when it comes to GDPR.
Jessica, I'd agree with that, and I hit one this week because I use a Chrome plugin extension, a new one that I tried. I tested it on myself. I tested the telephone number that they had against me. It was incorrect. I emailed the company and said, you have a wrong telephone number. Can you please correct? And their response was, I'm sorry, we have no means of manual correcting that data. Interesting. What do you make of that, Tiff?
I think that's where we're going to start to see who can actually put their money where their mouth is, aren't we? Lots and lots of organizations that don't have the capability to delete or correct erroneous data. They should have been able to do it for the last 20 years. Really, they've left it all very late. One of the phrases that if you've been on the circuit, the GDPR circuit, you will have come across is privacy by design. And it's a big thrust of GDPR is whenever you're implementing new systems, you should be thinking about data security in the course of putting those new systems together. So how are you going to ensure privacy? How easy can you make it to delete candidate data? So that lovely Comeet feature, delete candidate, get rid of all of their data. It's an absolute gift. We need more providers to be thinking along those lines and making sure that they're building in privacy by design.
I recently attended SourceCon conference, which is the sourcers, and they're all really great people, geeks, just cool hacks and sourcing tools that they use. And there is most of the time no way to delete that or update that data. So it's scary. It's also interesting to see how they're going to handle that going forward.
Yeah, on the plus side, GDPR is one of those rare bits of legislation where you do get points for effort as well as attainment. So even if you aren't perfect and you don't have all these problems solved, at least being able to show that you've thought about it, that you've assessed the risk, and that you've directed your efforts to addressing the areas of highest risk will go in your favor in the unlikely event, hopefully, that you have a data breach.
So while we were having this conversation, I did launch the third and final poll for the presentation. And so we're kind of split down the middle. Yes, we've talked to our partners. Some of us, it's 30%, no, it's 30%, and then some. So we have some work to do, it sounds like, before the May 25th deadline.
Even people who've been working on it for years have still got work to do before the May 25th deadline. So
a lot of late nights and early mornings for us coming forward. So next panel question kind of falls along those lines. Like, what questions should we be asking our technology vendors and partners? I'll start with Debbie, I guess.
Thanks. So, gosh, so many questions. If it were me, I would be sitting in a seat and I would, with the rest of my recruitment team, be asking all the questions that we need to understand if we have to face a deletion and work through each of the vendors and partners. The other thing that we've noticed, I think, recently is our recruitment agencies are not necessarily up to speed. So you may be dealing with 20, some people even deal with 30 different recruitment agencies. You're going to have to work your way through all of those. I guess the simplest thing to do, I don't know what you've seen, Tiffany, but is maybe send them a questionnaire, give them a timeline to respond, and then at least you know where you are. And it might give you an opportunity to perhaps reset the contractual boundaries of the nature of that relationship, because if they can't confirm that they are GDPR compliant, then maybe it's a way of cleaning up your preferred supplier list.
I think that's a really good idea, Debbie, using it as a housekeeping opportunity, because one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of organizations are being overwhelmed with these questionnaires. They're getting them from every single client. If an organization has got its act together, it will be able to provide you with its information. It won't need you to send it a questionnaire. So that's one good measure of how much on the front foot they are. You might find though some of your smaller providers will be hugely grateful if you send them a questionnaire, because frankly they don't have a clue what they're doing, and your questionnaire will provide the basis for their GDPR readiness program.
Let's move forward on to our next question here, panel question. What are some considerations beyond HR and recruiting that we should think about that are GDPR related? Matt, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, so there's obviously, it goes a lot wider than GDPR, and being in IT myself, everyone tends to assume it's just an IT issue, and it goes across the whole company. You know, even down to processes for what you do with your pages from your visitors book really should be done. But I think the key thing is not to be overwhelmed by it, and as we said before, you know, there is marks for effort. So if you have made an effort in some things, then you should be okay. But I would definitely have developed subject access request templates that you can answer with easily, because there is a timescale. If someone is submitting a subject access request, there is a timescale for responding, and there have been scare stories that, you know, with all these campaigns you might get on Twitter or Facebook. You could have a campaign where it's launched where 1,000 people send an SAR in to you, and you've got to think, what would that do to your business? I mean, it could
Wow.
put you under. So in the UK here, we have a thing called PPI, which was an insurance that was missold a few years ago. And there are hundreds and hundreds of companies that will pop up and will help claim to help you get your refund back from PPI insurance. People are saying that sometimes this might be the new PPI, and there'll be hundreds of people offering to help you, probably not GDPR compliant themselves, but offering to help you get your data removed, get your data deleted for a fee or something like that. So if you've got these templates ready and you can respond pretty quickly in a templated fashion to a subject access request, you'll be in a good place.
And I think the one thing I would add to that is a really, really good suggestion, Max. I think that's going to be quite scary for lots of organizations, especially those with a big public facing footprint. The other bit of housekeeping that we can all do now is minute your decisions. So as you start your GDPR readiness journey or progress along it, make sure that you keep good records of the thoughts that you've had, the reasons why you've taken certain actions, how you've determined that this is a legitimate interest for doing such and such a thing, or that consent request is appropriately worded. Just keeping those records will help to evidence that you have given this proper thought and help you get A for effort, even if you only get B for attainment.
Well, let's move forward to final thoughts here, and I'll start with Tiffany. So what nuggets of wisdom do you just want to reinforce or reiterate from the course of the last hour that we've almost spent together?
So the first thing is just take it seriously. It's not the end of the world as we know it. There will not be 1,000 fines going out to tiny recruiters all across the land on the 26th of May. So the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, in common with all of its sister entities around the European Union, is strapped for resources and strapped for cash. Largely this is because big corporates have been stealing all their staff. But they will be focusing on the worst offenders. So don't get too scared, but do take it seriously. That's my big advice.
What about Matt or Debbie?
I can jump in there. I would say, as far as possible, keep it simple. Use your own processes. Don't try and cookie cutter someone else's spreadsheet, flowchart, whatever. On the subject of spreadsheets, get off spreadsheets. If you're a small business, hiring on spreadsheets, and get onto a system like Comeet. don't forget peripheral stuff like apps that you might be using. I know, for example, Salesforce use a location GPS app, so don't forget to take those wearables, those new kind of wearables, into consideration as well. And look at it as an opportunity for a real qualitative approach to nurturing talent in the future. So kind of have that in mind as well whilst you're doing it.
Matt?
Just a UK one for me, really, because obviously the UK is going to be leaving the European Union, and people think that that means these rules won't then apply in the UK, but they are going to apply regardless.
I've had a couple people just mention that, like, oh, with Brexit happens, GDPR isn't going to be a problem in the UK. So you're saying that's not the case?
It will still be UK law, yeah.
Okay. One thing, I know we got a question from Stephanie, and we do have many Comeet customers on here. Comeet does take a stance and is very concerned about GDPR, and we have a great Comeet established GDPR guidelines. I have a link here for you. It'll also be at the end of the presentation for you to take a look at. Some things that when it comes to GDPR, that Comeet wants to re-emphasize, and they do in their guidelines, is there's no one-size-fits-all roadmap. They're committed to minimizing the effort on non-EU operations. So also ensuring flexibility and control. It's not one-size-fits-all, so we want to give you the flexibility to be able to implement, delete the data deletion, all those different things. Also, don't wait to begin GDPR compliance planning. That's why we're here. Let's start now. Don't be one of the 50% of companies at the end of 2018 that Gartner says are not prepared for GDPR. Comeet is committed to making this process simple for customers, and we see this as an opportunity. And I think most of us, everyone here in the panel, this isn't a scary presentation where we're like, oh my gosh, the world's going to end, the sky is falling. It is an opportunity for us to take advantage. We need to comply with the new regulations, but here's some ways that we can make our recruiting and candidate engagement better. All right, we have a number of questions, so I'm going to go ahead and do my best to answer, or to send a few out. You're welcome to continue to ask questions. We will be addressing questions that we don't get to at a later time, hopefully early next week. The question number one, what data can you and should you keep when a candidate asks to no longer be contacted? Tiffany?
I love this one because you get yourself into a bit of a circular argument. You need to have some data to prove that you don't have any data anymore. And again, there are no firm guidance notes on this yet. So we may get some over the next few months. But in the meantime, I would say the bare minimum that is necessary. So the name of the individual and the date of their request to be removed and the fact that they have been removed. So the bare minimum to say, yeah, this is what we've deleted this individual from our database. Otherwise, you've got no evidence that you've actually done that piece of work.
So an interesting follow-up question just came through. This question says, if we can't delete the candidate's information in our system, are we okay to change the record to just John Doe? Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a good next best, is to anonymize it. So there are rules about anonymized or pseudonymized data. I love the jargon that's coming out of here. So stuff that is more or less anonymized can wriggle out of the regulations, but it does depend on whether or not somebody who has access to that data would be able to take your anonymized data together with other information that they have or can easily access and link it to a particular individual. So the fact that I've John Doe'd it, if I've still got the address and the gender and the profession of the individual, it would be quite easy for me to figure out who that person is. So you need to go a little bit further than just changing the name.
Excellent.
And we do that all the time with speculative CVs anyway, so.
Second question that we have here, what happens if your vendor or technology doesn't have a position or resources related to GDPR? What should we do?
Change vendor.
there'll be a penalty potentially if we don't.
Well, if they don't have any position on GDPR and you're continuing to use them, then you're effectively saying, I am going to share your personal data with somebody and I have no clue what they're going to do with it next. So you can decide whether you think that's a good idea for your own GDPR compliance or not.
I think you're making yourself non-compliant by doing that.
Yeah.
You're gambling, yeah.
Yeah.
This is an interesting question that just came in, and I think one that we do need to address. Do we need to ask employees for their approval to keep their personal information as part of GDPR?
No, because it falls under a legitimate interest. So your employees will give data in order for you to pay them their salary, to give them work, to manage their performance. And provided you're only using their data for the things that are a natural consequence of employment, you don't need to ask for their consent. You can rely on a different legal basis, which is that it's partly required for you to have that data to fulfill the contract of employment you have with them, and partly there'll be things you're doing it that are to meet a legitimate interest. If you're going to do something else with it, so if you're going to pass it on to third parties who can advertise to them, for example, you would need consent to that.
Another question that's came in, we talked a little bit about a data protection officer, and that if you were a company based in the US, that you need to have an assigned data protection officer actually in the EU. But what about if you're an active site in the EU? Do you still need to have a data protection officer?
Well, again, it comes down to your size and the amount of data that you're processing. So if you're a small business and you're only processing a modest amount of information, then no, you don't have to have a nominated data protection officer. It's a good idea to have a named individual that people can contact. So in your privacy policy, for example, that you've got, even if it's a holding mailbox that you know is going to be checked, to have some means of people contacting you with data protection inquiries. I think Matt made a very good point earlier on when he said this is not exactly the plum job that everyone's going to be clamoring for, but somebody somewhere has to be accountable for making sure that the company's compliant.
Debbie, we had a question come in that I would like you to be able to address here. The question says, do I need to ensure that if I have an individual recruiter, maybe they're an external third-party individual recruiter that's supplying them with candidates, do they need to ensure that they're GDPR compliant?
Absolutely. And I think more and more often these days, we're finding that companies are using external recruiters or virtual recruiters for pieces of work. Many of those recruiters are operating on spreadsheets. Some of them have their own in-house systems, but yep, if they are recruiting candidates in Europe and if they're dealing with any with a European company, then they absolutely should meet GDPR. And just because I guess you're a one-man business, you should still be relevant to the regulations. Would you agree with that, Tiff?
Yeah, everybody has to comply with the regs. Everybody has to treat personal data appropriately. And that's true whether there's one person or 1,000 people in your organization. It's just that the scale of the potential penalties might change, but yeah, it's something that we all need to be doing.
I wanted to make sure that we asked this question specifically because I do feel like there are a lot of independent recruiters that are just one or two person organizations that are supporting, and they're not a contractor, so they're a third party, but many of them are operating with just spreadsheets or some sort of crazy database that they've sort of just piecemeal together.
Yeah, just simple things like making sure that you've got encryption switched on your laptop and that you've got a sensible password that you change periodically. So there'll be some straightforward technological tools that you can use to help keep data safe. Bear in mind, you're at risk if you allow personal data that you've collected or that's come into your possession to get into the hands of people that shouldn't have it. Now, nobody's going to be coming around knocking on your door, checking how good your subject access request process is if everything's been going tickety-boo. So if all of your data subjects are happy, if you're keeping their data safe and secure, you're responding to their inquiries in an appropriate manner, chances are you're never going to hear anything from the regulator. But you want to make sure that in the unfortunate event that you do get hacked, that data gets stolen, or that you have some number of disgruntled data subjects who think that you're abusing their data, that when the regulator comes knocking, that you can tell them a sensible story about how you've properly assessed the risk of the data you're holding and taken appropriate measures to keep it safe.
So I want to go ahead and we'll start to wrap this up. We do have a number of other questions, which I said before, keep them coming, and we will make sure to address those questions for you. I think we're going to record a little podcast together to kind of keep the banter and the good conversation going. I will tell you that Comeet will be sharing with you copies of the slides, resources, and the recorded archive of the webinar for you by Monday, for those of you watching live. If you're watching the recorded on-demand version, you'll have access to those same resources. So they should be embedded in the page, or you'll receive an email with all that information. And contained within that email, if you're so inclined, are the HRCI and SHRM recertification credits. So those will come to you on Monday. If it's on demand, check your inbox here in a few minutes. You should have those with you. Again, for those of you who are outside of the US, the HRCI and SHRM are the US equivalent of the CIPD bodies. I did want to take just a moment to thank you for attending the webinar today and taking time out of your busy schedule to participate. For some, maybe on this early morning or late afternoon. This was a good presentation. It was a great presentation, and I feel like it was made even better by your interactions and your questions and answers to the polls. Thank you so much to our expert panelists, Debbie Clement, Tiffany Kemp, and Matt Diss. I encourage you to connect with them directly on LinkedIn. I have shortened LinkedIn codes, so you can pop those in right now or at your leisure into your web browser of choice, and you'll be able to connect with them and continue the conversation. Additionally, at the bottom of this slide here, I have included a list of recommended resources, including the full GDPR regulation, like a bazillion pages. So if you need some late night reading, you're unable to sleep, check that out. The ICO resource that Tiffany mentioned, we referenced the Gartner GDPR study, and then we also have resources for you in terms of Comeet's GDPR resources page. That will also include, for those that have asked, information on US-based information, as well as EU information and resources. So we have a whole host of best practices and links for you to kind of get up to speed wherever you are working or living. Thank you again. This was a great presentation, and it was a great conversation. So thank you guys, and I hope that all of you have a wonderful rest of your day.